I am pleased to have Benjamin Cook joining us today. Now, Benjamin is a doctoral candidate in philosophy at Syracuse University and editor at Campus Reform. And he got in touch with me on Twitter and wanted to suggested the conversation. And I thought, hey, this might be interesting. He had talked about his own spiritual journey and relating to concepts like progressive Christianity and so on. So I'm going to kind of just throw it open. Benjamin, or Ben, you have an interesting journey. You gave me a little bit of a synopsis of your journey already. So I thought I would maybe share a little bit of that, uh, from evangelical, atheist, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, maybe give us the potted history there, but
Yeah.
also how this concept of deconstruction figures into that and where you're at now. And then how do you analyze the concept of deconstruction? You kind of just threw all that at me, but in a very succinct way. We can just kind of unpack it now and then tie it into my own current interest in the topic.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I was just telling you before we started recording that I'm a fan of a lot of your work. I think you help to bring a lot of light and bring down the heat, unnecessary heat in a lot of these conversations. So I very much appreciated that. Yeah, so in terms of my kind of spiritual journey or background, to try to summarize a very long I think anyone that talks about their spiritual journey, it's obviously always difficult to condense into kind of an elevator pitch or whatever you want to call it. But the long and short of it is that I grew up in a kind of generic, like evangelical Protestant family. I'm a military brat, so I went to a lot of different kinds of churches within that broad stream growing up because I moved a lot. But I would say generally more in the kind of Wesleyan or Free Methodist stream, I guess, of Protestantism. But we tended to just go to more non-denominational, kind of contemporary worship style, seeker-sensitive type churches for the most part growing up. So that was kind of my context. I definitely wouldn't say that I grew up with a fundamentalist evangelical background. There was always an appreciation for and an openness to the sciences and to philosophy and theology. That sort of thing was never discouraged. Questions were never discouraged. So that's something I'm very, very grateful for. I should also say that, and it's going to relate to the questions of deconstruction we'll talk about later. I had, and I know many other people don't have this experience, I had a very positive experience for the most part. The vast majority of churches that I went to within evangelical Protestantism, again, all around the country, I thought were very gracious, very open. Again, I never felt like questions or anything like that were discouraged. So I want to say that just to say that there is a lot of positivity like within that world, while also recognizing that that's clearly not everyone's experience. And I know that a lot of people who have deconstructed, I think especially many who have end up deconstructing into either progressive Christianity or just losing their faith, very often have a much more negative or sometimes even traumatic experience. So I just want to acknowledge that. So I first read C.S. Lewis when I was in high school. I think for most people, that's their kind of a gateway drug to all of theology and philosophy and apologetics and all that sort of thing. I read Mere Christianity, and that really got me interested in that whole world. So at first I was just kind of interested in apologetics in high school. But one thing leads to another, and that got me interested in different theological traditions within particularly Protestantism. So of course I wanted to explore whether Arminianism or Calvinism was true. Also at the time, the emerging church was really kind of like coming into its own. This is kind of like the peak of the popularity of people like Rob Bell with his, I think it was called his like Numa series of videos.
This is like mid 2000s.
Yes.
Early, yeah. Okay.
So I think this would have been around like 2005, 2006, like around that time. So it's kind of like at the moment when both the emerging church and the new Calvinist movement were kind of like both at the forefront. And those were the kind of like two like big competitors in a way, I think, for especially for young people that were first kind of exploring their faith and trying to decide where to go, right? And so I guess it's just kind of part of my personality that it's easy for me to kind of see where multiple sides are coming from once I like research in depth a particular position. And so it became a very kind of theologically chaotic time in my life, you know. So I think I first got more interested in the emerging church stuff. So I was reading people like Randal and Shane Claiborne, I think, had his, I forgot what it was called. I think it was The Irresistible Revolution or something like that. Yeah. Stuff like that. And I was really compelled about a lot of the stuff. A lot of the stuff they said was really refreshing. You know, it helped me kind of look at the faith in a new way. I liked the emphasis on the life of Christ and how his teachings have more of a this worldly, like practical import. So I got into that. I also got into N.T. Wright, although N.T. Wright, I don't think I would consider him a progressive Christian, but some of his work I think has had a big impact on a lot of progressive Christians, because I think N.T. Wright also really emphasized the kind of new creational, incarnational aspect of the gospel, right? That we kind of participate in living into the kingdom, right? In this world. So I first got into that, but then I kept studying, and again, kind of, blown to and fro by every wind of doctrine. I got more into the new Calvinist movement. I think that was also a very natural thing, I think, especially for young men at the time. If anyone's into Myers-Briggs, I'm an INTP, so I very much like systematic kind of thinking and kind of putting everything in a deductive order and so forth. And within the Protestant world, I think Calvinism, part of the reason it has an appeal is because of that, right? You have your 5 points, they have this kind of systematic connection and so forth. That was attractive to me.
Hey,
go ahead.
Just interject. So one of the things about Calvinism is that it's like coffee, right? It's or beer. It's not something that people like at first taste. They acclimate to it. They develop a taste for it. And I think sometimes, just spitballing here, but maybe some of that also is a machismo thing. It's like a disconnection from your feelings of compassion for others. Did any of that, as you look back on it, figure into your experience?
So I definitely think in the New Calvinist movement in general, that there was the machismo thing, as you said, prevalent, especially, with the whole Mars Hill thing and all that sort of stuff. For me, it wasn't as much that. I mean, there was kind of the appeal, that the kind of like rigidity in a logical sense that I think appeals to, I guess, the kind of the masculine disposition, however you want to think about that. But the kind of disconnecting oneself from one's feelings and so forth, that was not really a part of it for me. But I agree with you. I do think like part of the trend that was happening at the time was this kind of more kind of like browbeating, like, well, if they go to hell, whatever, that this sort of compassionless attitude. I would like to think that didn't play a role, but the heart is deceitful, so who knows? It might have. So there was that, and then from there, kind of more embracing a kind of reformed view. And this is all taking place like within a few years. So this is like mid to late high school, and then it kind of bled a little bit into my first year of undergrad. So from Calvinism, I got more interested in church history. And so I started looking into like what the early church fathers thought about things. I mean, at this point, I had almost never even heard of the church fathers, right? And so I was like, oh, I wonder what they thought. It seems like some people will refer to them, and a lot of people think that studying what they had to say will kind of like guide our journey into the correct theology, so to speak, or ecclesiology. And so I looked into that, and very quickly was taken in by a lot of Roman Catholic apologetics. I'm now Eastern Orthodox, so I still agree with much of what I found at that time. Not all of it, of course. But I found it very compelling when I read the Apostolic and then, like the pre-Nicene and the Nicene Fathers. It seemed very clear to me that they had a very high ecclesiology, that they believed in things like apostolic succession, the real presence in the Eucharist, baptismal regeneration, and so forth. And so, long story short, from there, I ended up converting to Roman Catholicism my freshman year of college. But that didn't last long. And the details of that are kind of too extensive, and some of them, I guess, too personal to get into. But a lot of it had to do with the kind of excessive legalism of Roman Catholic spirituality, the definition of mortal sin, the notion that, if you get hit by a bus on the way to confession and you didn't have perfect contrition, then you're damned to hell, right? Stuff like that. It's, I think, for someone with my cast
You mean with having committed a moral sin?
yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. It became more and more, I felt like, kind of unlivable for me. Even though I was convinced of a lot of the doctrine, I felt like I almost couldn't engage with it like in a mentally healthy way, if that makes sense. And so from there, I felt like I just kind of like needed space from like engaging with theology at all, because I just felt like it was becoming very unhealthy for me. And with that space, and I was majoring in philosophy, I started to become a little more open to, so I was already very familiar with traditional apologetics, arguments for God's existence, these sorts of things. But my kind of distance from like active church participation, I think, and what I was studying, it made me a little more open to traditional atheistic arguments, the more rigorously like formulated versions of them. So like J.L. Schellenberg's argument from divine hiddenness, or William Rowe's formulation of the evidential argument from evil, things like that. And so that basically just turned me into a agnostic. Depending on the day, I might be more atheistic or more theistic leaning, but definitely not Christian, for basically the next like 7 or 8 years. So I spent a very long time away from the faith. And again, that was both intellectual, but also there was that residual kind of, I guess, pain experience, residual pain associated, I guess, with active engagement with the church and with faith. So then my first year of graduate school, again, many years later, for a variety of reasons, but one of the big reasons was I started kind of taking an interest in theology again and reading more deeply in the church fathers, especially people like Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, St. Maximus, people like that. I was also reading a lot of George MacDonald, who had a very, very significant impact on me. If anyone has never read him, I highly recommend you read George MacDonald.
I took a course on him in university.
Oh, you did? Oh, that's wonderful.
Very interesting fellow.
Yeah, he was a huge influence on C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Chesterton. So yeah, I feel like thinkers like that, and then kind of my own experience of God, especially in nature, kind of like started to open me back up again to faith and kind of seeing it in a new way. And I had also never explored the Eastern side of the Christian tradition. Funnily enough, I'd been, Arminian and Calvinist and emerging and Catholic and whatever, but I think because the Orthodox just have such a minority presence in the West, especially at that time, there was barely anything online. Now, online Orthodoxy is a much bigger thing, I think, both for good and for ill. But yeah, so I started looking into that more. And I was really just both experientially and intellectually drawn in by the Eastern Orthodox tradition. But when I came back to faith, I still wasn't like confident in that side of things. So I was like, I'll just kind of like be an Anglican until I know what I think. So I was attending an Anglican church, but eventually, again, because I felt like I had been drawn in that direction for a while, I converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. So I've officially been Eastern Orthodox, received into the church a little over a year now. But I was a kind of unofficial catechumen for like a year or a little more before that. So that's the spiritual journey. So I don't know where you want me to go from here in terms of talking about like deconstruction, or like or like the patristic tradition, or
Well, first of all, let me just ask you, the grass is always greener on the other side, as they say. So, one of the things that has always bothered me about the Orthodox tradition, maybe start with this, is the kind of Caesaral papism, the
Mhm.
tendency of the church to get very much aligned with the state. And recently, of course, within Russia, Bishop Kirill has
Yeah.
become notorious for becoming a prop for Putin. And I mean, coming from a Baptist tradition where we're kind of always saying, "Hey, let's be
Mhm.
careful about the church state relationship." That's one of the things that always kept me Baptist and which I really appreciated. Does that disturb you? How do you think about those issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing I should say, talking like if we're going to talk about anything directly related to Orthodoxy, obviously, I I don't speak for the Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
I'm an Orthodox neophyte, so I don't want to again be what I think is all too common these days, where someone's converted to the Orthodox Church and all of a sudden they think they're this expert theologian and they need to go tell everyone what's up on the internet. So I don't want to do that. But just speaking just from my personal opinion, open to correction here. I definitely agree that there's been a lot of abuse with that. There currently is a lot of abuse with that, like you said. I think especially with Bishop Kirill and with Putin's regime in Russia, and that's very sad. It's very tragic. It's very disappointing. I don't think that it's essential to Orthodoxy that this occur. I think there are historically contingent reasons why there has been more of a close church-state relationship in a lot of historically Orthodox countries. Um, so that's the negative side, but I would also say that although I used to be much more influenced by the kind of Baptist and Anabaptist stream of thought in terms of this kind of wholesale skepticism of the church being involved in the state or public politics in any way, I'm not convinced by that anymore. That's not to say that I think that in any particular nation or any particular time of history, we need like a Christian king or something like that. But I think in principle, there can be a beneficent relationship. I think the relationship can either go very, very wrong or it can be helpful. So I think a lot of people, when they talk about St. Constantine, for example, it's easy to focus on the ways in which the faith was compromised in that relationship, but um but I think in a lot of those discussions what's ignored is how beneficial to society that relationship actually was, in terms of, for example, Constantine, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you know more about this than I do, but I think one of the things that Constantine did in his Christian empire was he at least attempted to try to start outlawing the Colosseum games, right? Where is that correct?
Temporarily, yeah, they started up again, and there wasn't, I think, until 404 that they finally ceased. But I
Yeah,
mean, that would just be one example of there were many pro-social and I think
right, right.
benefits consistent with the kingdom. It's always
Yeah,
that. I mean, it's like an ink blotters, right? Two people look at it and they see very different things.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, so I think it's something that like God can use, but we shouldn't make an idol of the symphonia concept, I guess.
Now, when I talk to my friend Trent Horn, well-known Catholic apologist, I'm always trying to get him on board with what I am, which is an ecclesial pluralist.
Yeah.
And I believe God providentially calls people into different ecclesial traditions, and different individuals can be faithful witnesses to the kingdom within God's will and desire within those distinct traditions. So I give the example, well, Billy Graham as a Presbyterian and Baptist was where God wanted him to be. Mother Teresa as a Catholic was where God wanted her to be. Trent at the end of the day is like, he ultimately thinks everybody should be within the Catholic Church. Where do you stand on that kind of issue? Do you sort of see you finally come home
Mhm.
to the home of all Christians, or is it kind of like home works for you?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I definitely, I don't think one can be a consistent Orthodox Christian, and in the sense of like really understanding and trying to abide by the dogmatic tradition and think that it's just what works for me. But like you said, to be an ecclesial pluralist. I'm not an ecclesial pluralist. I do think all Christians are called to be Orthodox. I think it's the fullness of the faith. But I think like most Orthodox people, theologians would say, you've probably heard this before, that we know the fullness of the church is within Orthodoxy, but we don't know where the church is not, or we don't know that the Spirit is not working in other ecclesial traditions, right? I'm very much inclined to think that the Spirit is. I mean, you see the fruits of the Spirit in very obvious ways, in my humble opinion, in Anabaptist, Baptist, Catholic, like in many traditions. So that's
but it would be your view then that Billy Graham was outside God's will in remaining a Baptist, Presbyterian, and then a Baptist, or Mother Teresa was outside of God's will and remaining Catholic, even though they did good things.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to ask you just about Orthodoxy, you described with the Catholic view, you called it legalism in your estimation, and kind of was maybe increased your stress load, right? Thinking about all these issues. Of course, Orthodoxy, I think, is well known for not having the same kind of definition on a whole range of theological issues, whether it's apophaticism about the divine nature or the nature of election and your whole Calvinist Arminian deal or other issues. Is that an attraction for you, that there's sort of a bigger role for mystery within that tradition?
Yes, very much so. And I think, and part of that is just like, I think that's objectively good, but I think it's been like uniquely helpful for someone like me who, like I said earlier, tends to like obsessively want to have everything in a kind of system and everything's nailed down and defined. So it's been very refreshing, and it's helped to kind of get me out of my head, right? And another thing about Orthodoxy is it's very sensory. It's very, we're kissing icons, we're bowing, we're making the sign of the cross, like, and so it helps to kind of like reconnect spirituality like with one's body, and that's very difficult for me naturally. And so it's been very healing for me in a lot of ways to engage with the faith in that more kind of practical, like incarnational way.
Okay. Right, well, let's turn then to talk a little bit about the concept of deconstruction, how you understand that concept, how it functions, and how, in your case, it ultimately did lead you to Orthodoxy.
Yeah. So the way I would understand it, I think as you've pointed out in some of your discussions, obviously it's a very nebulous kind of concept. I think you've used the language of it has a broad semantic range. And so I don't think there's like an essence of the notion of deconstruction. I think there's a kind of set of ideas that have a family resemblance, right? To use a Wittgensteinian notion here. But there aren't like necessary and sufficient conditions. But I would say the term tends to be used to just refer to the process of critically reflecting on one's typically more traditional or conservative, even more specific than that, I think it overwhelmingly tends to be used in evangelical circles, right? So the process of critically reflecting on and usually abandoning at least some subset of traditional or conservative evangelical Christian ideas or doctrines or practices. So I think that's how I would understand deconstruction, but I think in terms of its meaning, quote unquote, but I also think it tends to not denote, but it tends to connote a certain result of that process, right? So I think most people who use the term deconstruction, it tends to be associated with either coming to a place of disbelief in Christianity entirely or an agnosticism about it, or coming to a kind of self-identified progressive Christian viewpoint. So that's what I would say. Does that track with how you would tend to understand what it means or what it connotes?
On the latter point, so moving toward progressive Christian, I just try to say, well, So the way that term is used, Kurt introduces how do we use that term. Actually,
And
maybe
it's nebulous as
before,
well.
yeah, why don't I invite you to share how you then understand becoming a progressive Christian,
Mhm.
and then I could offer response at that point.
Yeah. So here's where I think, because I've followed a lot of the kind of back and forth, well, indirect back and forth between you and others in Illicit Childers. And here's where I think you have a more helpful understanding of progressive Christianity than I think Elisa Childer does. I do think that she kind of casts way too broad of a net. So like, I don't think everyone who's a progressive Christian is a relativist or a postmodernist or like these sorts of things. I think some are, right? But many aren't. So I forgot, do you identify yourself as a progressive Christian or kind of, or not
I mean,
really?
for years, probably 10 years or more, I've called myself a progressive evangelical.
Okay.
In some contexts, I wouldn't use the term evangelical because it's often laden with baggage, as you certainly
Yeah.
know. In other contexts, I wouldn't use the term progressive. So it's really contextualized.
Yeah. 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 So I definitely think that, so someone like you, you believe in the Trinity, you believe in the incarnation. So basically, like, you believe in Nicene Orthodoxy, like, at a minimum. Right? Would that be right?
Sure.
Yeah. And so you believe, in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the uniqueness of that. I think many other progressive Christians do. So then the question is, okay, if a progressive Christian is not someone who's necessarily a wholesale relativist or postmodernist, and a progressive Christian could even accept like the Apostles and or the Nicene Creed, well, like, does that mean a progressive, like, what distinguishes a progressive Christian? Um, Again, here's where I think, just thinking about how the concept tends to be used in most contexts, is helpful, although I wouldn't want to say, again, this is a strict definition. I think in most contexts, when people self-identify as a progressive Christian, typically the reason has more to do with doubting traditional Christian ethics, certain points thereof, right? I think that tends to be the kind of sticking point, especially around issues of human sexuality or abortion. Um, and I think that kind of makes sense because outside of the theological context in our culture at large, progressive obviously tends to have a political connotation. So there's a kind of overlap there. It's natural if you start to have more progressive views about issues like human sexuality and abortion, then you're going to kind of attach this progressive moniker onto your Christianity. So that's my understanding of progressive Christianity. But again, I agree, it's a very contextual concept. It's a very nebulous idea. But I think that's the kind of trend I see in how it tends to be used. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think the sexual ethics, in particular, abortion, somewhat maybe a little bit less, but also very
Yeah.
important. So ethics more broadly, yes. But I also think theological issues are huge there. So issues about how to understand atonement,
Oh, yes, I would agree that,
understand
yes.
hell, and
Yeah.
also the science relationship, which is actually more generally, I think, in terms of methodology, um, the person who's calling themselves a progressive Christian is probably shifting away from what they perceive to be a more naive biblicism
Yeah.
that they were raised with, where all doctrine is somehow derived from the Bible, and they're, to go back to your Wesleyan tradition background, sort of coming to a broader sense of all these other sources that can inform how we
Yeah.
do doctrine, such as science, psychology, philosophical ethics, and all these other things. And so, yeah, in terms of, I think that there's two big groups. It seems to me that probably the most significant one is, or are people who came out of a narrow conservative evangelicalism or fundamentalism and are reacting against that,
Mhm.
and so they're defining themselves as progressive relative to what they've come out of. And I think you see that from people like Rob Bell or Brian McLaren or Rachel Held Evans, that they typically did come out of these very conservative backgrounds and reacted to them. The other group I find are people who come from a mainline tradition, like John Shelby Spong, they've also used the term, but they're very different. They're a very different kind of thing. Their
I agree.
theological method is very different. It's a mainline theological method, which doesn't have the same not acquiescence, the same, just drawing upon historical orthodoxy that you were referring to a moment ago.
Yeah.
And so I often find, in terms of the blurring of the ham-fisted objections to progressive Christians from conservative evangelicals, they talk about J. Gresham Machen's, well, this is another Christianity, back to his famous book, Christianity and Liberalism from 1924. And they're conflating that liberalism with all progressive Christians today, which
Yeah.
is not
Although I
true.
think there'd be an overlap. There's often a substantial overlap.
There's an overlap, yeah. But on the other hand, I would also push back saying that all those people are not Christians. Back to the whole Schleiermachian tradition, I think, is much more nuanced itself than the conservative critics give it credit for being. So there's that piece. But yeah, the main thing is I would align with those that came out of the conservative background. So
Yeah. Yeah. So then I guess from there, so I think we're largely in agreement about, how to kind of understand the concepts involved. So from my perspective, so I wouldn't want to say I have objections to progressive Christianity because, again, it's not a monolith. I would need to talk to an individual and ask, like, what exactly do you mean by that, right? My objections are more to certain trends I see, trends of thought or ways of thinking that I see within many communities, I guess predominantly online, but in person as well, I've encountered, that would self-identify as deconstructing or deconstructed and or progressive Christian. So I guess I can just kind of like list off what some of those concerns are with those
sure.
trends, and you can tell me if you see the same trends or if you'd want to push back on any of this.
Sure.
So the first trend I feel like I often see is, it strikes me, and again, I'm not judging any specific individual because I can't mind read. So I'm just talking about general impressions I get from the kind of discourse and rhetoric I see. But again, I could easily be completely wrong about the inner life and motivations in any specific case. But it strikes me that there's often a trend of being very critical of traditional conservative Christian beliefs in any specific area, but not being as critical about idiosyncratically modern philosophical beliefs that I think are often just kind of adopted through kind of cultural osmosis once one finds oneself outside of traditional conservative paradigms or ideas, and in particular in the moral sphere, right? So, many have pointed out that many philosophers and theologians have pointed out that the kind of moral discourse that dominates modern Western societies is discourse that has to do with principles like, if you're not harming someone in some overt or physical way or coercing someone, then whatever you're doing is permissible. Or a principle like, if you're being authentic to how you're feeling, or you're being authentic to your personal experience or the way that you think, then continuing to act based on those feelings or have those ideas is morally permissible or good, right? Or a principle kind of related to the no harm principle, like, if what you do tends to maximize happiness and or tends to minimize overall suffering, then it is good, and if it's the contrary, then it's bad. Now, anyone who's read to some extent in the history of philosophy will immediately recognize these principles as not just coming from nowhere, right? So the no harm kind of ethic was developed by John Stuart Mill, for example, in the 19th century. And it was a specific kind of incarnation of a broader utilitarian moral theory that was developed by his kind of philosophical father, in a way, Jeremy Bentham, also in the 19th century. The whole idea that the good life is defined as the authentic life, right? This was something that was developed by the existentialists, especially like Jean-Paul Sartre and people like that. So what I often feel like occurs with people who are deconstructing or have deconstructed is they are implicitly imbibing these sorts of moral principles in a way that often seems very unreflective. Like they don't really know where they came from, and they haven't actually critically assessed those, right? But then they use those moral principles to judge, for example, like traditional Christian views on ethics in a variety, right, of areas, or for example, also in terms of the relationship of religion to politics. Now, that's not to say that someone who is aware of that philosophical history, right, wouldn't, if they investigated it, maybe they would just end up being convinced by the arguments, right? But I think for many people, they haven't done that investigation, and they're just the kind of these philosophical ideas that are highly controversial, even to this day in the philosophical literature, and need to be argued for, have just kind of trickled down into the general population. And once people are out of a conservative context, they're like, oh, well, this is the moral discourse. And so this is the discourse I'm going to use to critique my former paradigm. I see that as a trend, and I see it as problematic insofar as many of those people, I think, again, have not turned their criticism onto those. And I think it's a problem because, in my view and in my personal journey, kind of going back to that, I found that conservative or more like traditional ideas about like associated with Christian theology, both more metaphysically and more practically in terms of ethics, they can actually be given a much more robust intellectual foundation that I think many people realize, and I think largely that's the fault of many evangelical churches, and I think you would agree with this, for often having more of a kind of anti-intellectual bent where people's questions aren't really answered. And a lot of churches are just kind of evangelical churches, they're just not really aware of that great tradition, right? They're not aware of the most profound writings of the church fathers, or of people like Thomas Aquinas, right, and John Duns Scotus and people like that, that really, in my view, showed that traditional Christian beliefs, like I said, both theologically and morally, actually make sense, right? They're not just these kind of arbitrary rules that are just made up by like bigoted people, right? So I guess I'll let you respond to that first. What do you think of that?
Yeah, let me just say, as you've talked the last 40 minutes or so, two Chesterton quotes came to mind. The first one to sort of encapsulate your journey. I did try to found a little heresy of my own, and when I had put the last touches on it, I discovered it was orthodoxy. You just have to make it a big O, and that would capture your first journey.
It
And then
does.
the second one that just came to mind in the last couple of minutes, the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried.
Mhm.
So I kind of, to summarize what you're saying here, is, hey, the grand Christian tradition has resources and ethical frameworks and that are maybe through some sort of naive chronological snobbery or something, we're being more impacted. Some progressives are being more impacted by modern thin secular philosophy than by this grand tradition that we should be exploring more fully.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, and kind of the deeper that I got into my philosophical education, especially getting more into metaethics, for example, the more I realized, in my view, just how impoverished like modern moral philosophy is, I guess broadly construed as having these kind of strains of consequentialism, a kind of no harm, a kind of like contractarian, right, view, and then the kind of existentialist, like self-actualization and authenticity kind of views of the moral life. The more I read and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there's just not much to be said for these, like as as metaethical positions, right, that are meant to actually explain and ground our moral lives and human flourishing. And then the other side of that coin was getting deeper, for example, into the natural law and like the virtue ethics tradition that has been part of the Christian tradition for a long time, but is actually, I think, more extensively developed in the West than in the East, with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. And then more recently, people like Elizabeth Anscombe and Philippa Foot and people like that. I saw that it's a much more plausible theory of metaethics. And what's interesting is, on its own philosophical terms, it's just more compelling. But a more traditional view of the moral life and human sexuality and et cetera, I think actually falls out from this metaethical perspective, right?
I mean, there's no doubt that there's truth in your analysis. I mean, it's broad enough that it's going to catch some people on the net. I'm writing a book right now on same-sex relationships and the theology and ethics of it. It's a little bit on hold because the semester is kind of busy right now. But one of the things that has concerned me about the affirming side is when I see there's not an insignificant number of people that take it much further, in a sense of going on to defending positions like polyamory. Right? And arguably some of the principles that you're talking about here are very much functioning there as a justifying framework for this even more radical theological move into what I think is a very unrestrained libertine and toxic sexual ethic. So it certainly concerns me. I do think there are many cases where the positions that people take probably underdetermine that precise diagnosis. So in other words, they could be simply adopting like an ethical, like a Wesleyan quadrilateral theological framework where they're thinking, look, experience plays a role. It's nothing is infallible, but experience plays a role in my theological reflection. So let's say I'm same-sex attracted, because of course, again, the sexual ethics issue is still the biggest one going. So if I'm same-sex attracted and I've tried to change my sexual orientation and that has not produced any fruit, it's only led me to suicide or like to suicidal thoughts. And I've tried celibacy and it's agonizing and I don't think I'm called to celibacy. And then now I'm trying a monogamous chaste relationship with one other person of the same sex. And it's showing all the fruits of a relationship that is in all the best relationships of the opposite sex attracted couples that I know. Then that provides some sort of evidence that maybe I should consider that as I'm reading what Paul's saying in Romans 1 or in 1 Corinthians 6. So it's granting this role to experience. It's not necessarily, I think, adopting utilitarian ethic, but it could be, but it need not be. I mean, what do you think of that?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I definitely think, like, in principle, there can be this more nuanced approach to some of these issues. Like you said, that's not just being an existentialist or being like an unhinged utilitarian or something like that. I agree with that. However, I think that similar kind of idiosyncratically modern views about the moral life can still end up kind of coming through the back door in more subconscious or implicit ways. So, for example, like we talk about the fruits of certain kinds of practice, right, or certain kinds of relationship. I think we need to be very careful and be very self-critical in asking ourselves, what do I mean by a fruit here? Why am I understanding it as good or interpreting it as good? Also being careful, I think, to distinguish aspects of our experience that kind of contingently overlap, but that can conceptually be distinguished, right? So, for example, we might have a particular relationship where there is actually a lot that's objectively good about it, right? Connecting with another person on a deep way, having a profound friendship, bearing each other's burdens, right? All these sorts of things can exist, right, and do exist in many, for example, same-sex relationships, but we can speak much more broadly here. But I think sometimes people will either explicitly or implicitly then engage in the kind of non sequitur and therefore say, every aspect of this relationship or every aspect of this practice is morally permissible, because in these areas there are these objectively good fruits. Does that make sense?
Sure, we could have a polyamorous relationship in which the thruple or whatever it is, they look out and help one another when they're ill, and it doesn't, let's say, and it doesn't thereby justify or elevate the entire relationship or legitimize it.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to get the, like, give me your next big one, and
Okay.
and then we'll just go from there.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I'll cut to the one that more intersects with why I became Eastern Orthodox. But I think also applies to people who deconstruct and then become either like traditional Anglicans or Roman Catholics. I don't think it's unique to Orthodoxy. And that is that when it comes to the theological side, so you talked about like the atonement and hell and these sorts of doctrines that also tend to be kind of the first to be criticized and often make people question and deconstruct it either out of the faith or have more progressive views on it. I would say that in a similar way to how there are resources in that bigger tradition, right, that goes back to the patristic era in the Middle Ages and so forth, and has been developed since then, but often people are unaware of it. So like a lot of people just would have no idea who I'm talking about. For example, if I talk about like Philippa Foot or Elizabeth Anscombe, right? So unfortunately, a lot of their ideas haven't really trickled down, but more leftist ideas tend to more quickly. So I think theologically, there are a lot of good resources in that great tradition to better understand or have a more nuanced or helpful understanding of doctrines like eternal punishment and like the atonement. So one thing that I know is often talked about in the kind of evangelical versus progressive Christian debate is penal substitutionary atonement. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you have also pointed out in some contexts that we shouldn't be identifying a penal substitutionary view of the atonement with historic Christianity, right? Because one thing that one will quickly realize if you go back and read the Church Fathers is that the notion of penal substitution, at least as it was understood by the reformers, is absent, I think, at least in the vast majority of Church Fathers when they talk about the atonement. Much more common are theories of the atonement, like the ransom theory, or Christus Victor, or recapitulation that you see, for example, in Irenaeus. And so from an Orthodox, and I think Catholics and a lot of more like Anglo-Catholic Anglicans that are like more traditional high church, I think would say, would take issue with the notion that if you question a particular version of penal substitutionary atonement, then you're outside historic Christianity. Because from the Catholic and Orthodox perspective, there are a lot of idiosyncratically Protestant doctrines like that from our perspective, that's not historic Christianity, that's Christianity from the time of the Reformation. Right? We need to go deeper. We need to go like deeper into Christian history to understand that. And so I think if someone's troubled, again, especially by these more caricatured views of penal substitution, like God was, angry at Jesus and had to pour out his, angry wrath and fury in order for us to be saved, you won't really see that, for example, in the Church Fathers that knew the apostles. That's striking, right? You also won't see, as a side note, things like imputed righteousness. So these things were meant to identify with historic Christianity, like someone like Childers will claim. People are going to have a rude awakening when they actually look deeper into the history. And they'll see that a lot of stuff that Luther and Calvin developed is very idiosyncratic. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're kind of, again, underscoring the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting, but found, I would say, not found difficult and left untried, but rather been misunderstood and left untried. I mean, I agree. Like, so that's been one of my major critiques of Childers in my book, is that when she articulates what Christianity is, historic Christianity, as she calls it, It looks a whole lot like conservative evangelicalism, like you would have
Yeah.
learned from Calvary Chapel, where she grew up in California. And it's very much unlike, in key respects, this grand tradition that you're talking about,
Yeah.
that you do find in Orthodoxy or in Anglicanism or Catholicism.
Yeah.
And you do find that as well, right? With no doubt, with progressive Christians, that much of what they react against, which they often can't distinguish from um, Christianity more broadly, but they conflate the two, is a conservative evangelicalism. So especially those who end up leaving Christianity altogether,
Mhm.
they're what they're leaving is, and they don't even realize it, maybe, is a conservative evangelicalism. I
Exactly.
had a conversation a couple of years ago with one fellow, and I was pointing out some of these things to him. He was an atheist, and he was saying, well, I'm not a Christian because, eternal conscious torment and penal substitution. And I was going one after another through these issues, providing responses to them, saying, well, either that's not the Orthodox mainstream, or that's one opinion within the Orthodox mainstream, and there are other alternatives. And his final response was this: well, that ship has sailed. And
That's so sad. That's tragic.
it is tragic. What a sad commentary. Now I kind of get it though. It's like, once you've shifted out of the plausibility framework, you can't just jump back into it.
Yeah.
And so I get, it's like, yeah, that ship has sailed. I mean, I can't dispute what you're saying, but
Yeah.
I'm not there anymore. So
Yeah.
in closing, then, what would be your advice to a progressive Christian or someone who calls
Yeah.
themselves that?
Well, can I say one more quick thing
Yeah,
about?
for sure.
Okay. So, because I think what I'm about to say, I think has much that has to do with the great tradition. It has much more broad application. Like, it ends up influencing the atonement and how we understand hell and a lot of other things. And I think it's this. I think many, and I grew up this way as well. I think many, if not most, evangelical Christians still have a very anthropomorphic and anthropopathic view of God. So, like, when they talk about penal substitution, for example, thinking that the view is that God is like literally angry, right? That like God is having a fit of rage and he needs to take it out on someone. Similarly, with the doctrine of hell, that, well, like God is loving to some people, but some people he's just like eternally furious with, in the way that we have a kind of fit of rage, right? And this applies to other areas, again, like thinking about God as if he just is kind of, a guy with a beard in heaven that's like making arbitrary rules for people. Again, if you look into the great tradition, especially the church fathers, East and West, the great saints, and this is true like from the beginning. So I think this reflects the apostolic mind as well. Speaking in terms of God's wrath and anger and these sorts of anthropopathic, actually specifically having to do with passions, speaking in this way has always been understood by the great tradition as a condescension to human language and to human concepts. But in the entire patristic tradition, they all say, but God in himself does not have different attitudes, right? He's not literally angry, for example, in the way that we are. He doesn't change his mind about things. God is immutable, impassible, right? These sorts of traditional ideas associated with classical theism. But a lot of people are unaware of that. And I think it's easier to deconstruct and then to abandon the faith when you still have this very anthropomorphic or anthropopathic picture of God in your head, right? That, because it seems silly, right? C.S. Lewis talks a lot about this in Screwtape Letters. Like, the images we have in our head can often have much more influence on us than our reason. If we have a kind of silly picture in our head as a kind of man in the sky having a fit of rage or something like that, then yeah, that is a very childish view of God. But none of the great thinkers of the tradition, both East and West, have ever taken that language literally. They would say talking about God's anger is like talking about God's hand, right? Or God smelling something. These are not literal things, right? They're condescensions to our language. So I just think, and this goes to your final question, I think that my advice to people that are wrestling with deconstruction, as I have over the years, or who I think maybe are prematurely committing themselves to certain more progressive Christian ideas, to at least give the deeper tradition of the church a chance. I would highly recommend reading the early church fathers and medieval scholastic philosophers as well. I would start with people like Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory the theologian. If you want to go really wild, Dionysius the Areopagite. And for the more ethical, systematic side of things, I would recommend people like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and see if after going deeper into that tradition, you still think that there's nothing to be said for more traditional Christian ideas. That would be my advice.
All right. I'll just say specifically, I would recommend probably Augustine's Confessions, right? And there's so many good translations of it. And first major autobiography in Western literature. It's a pretty striking book. Yes. And for Aquinas, I would say maybe Compendium of Theology is an accessible way into him. Now this actually opens a whole can of worms, because I have all sorts of problems with classical theism, but I will say this. The main point is to challenge our thinking about falling in the trap of God as essentially a glorified creature.
Exactly.
God is like just a projection of a very great human being, and to appreciate transcendence as a general concept and condescendence and immanence, and live in a little bit in that tension, which certainly that tradition invites us to do in a way that I think, many of the sort of milquetoast, wishy-washy theologies that you get today do not. I mean,
yes. And the hunger for mystery, right?
Yeah.
Which especially the Orthodox tradition really embraces, right? That the mysticism that I think a lot of people think that they can only find, for example, in like Eastern, religions like Buddhism or whatever. Like Christianity has a profound mystical tradition that is largely ignored or bashed sometimes in evangelical contexts. So
it was back in 1999, I first encountered Thomas Weinandy when I was doing my PhD in London, and he had just was coming out with his book, Does God Suffer, at that time, which was a major defense of impassibility. And while I don't know that I agree with his overall classical theistic framework, one thing he did very well was pointing out how noxious and overt the caricatures and straw men of impassibility are. This kind of idea that God doesn't care. Clark Pinnock, Canadian theologian, he published this book, Most Moved Mover, as a critique of classical theism, when ironically, the classical theist understanding of impassibility is probably closer to Most Moved Mover. That God cannot be more moved from us because he is fully actualized. Exactly. Not that he doesn't care and is disengaged. And so there's so much misunderstanding.
Yes.
At the very least, clear away the straw men and then see what you think of the tradition.
Exactly. Yeah. God's love is so intense, so, like you said, fully actual, and to use the language of Pseudo-Dionysius, so ecstatic, right, for creation, that nothing can affect it because it's so pure and it's so intense. Exactly. Yeah. It's not like a stoic, just, I don't care. Yeah.
Right. Well, I would say that is a great note on which to end. So, Ben, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.